What if the assassination that started World War I was just a convenient excuse? We all learned in school that the war began when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo. But that's like saying the Titanic sank just because it hit an iceberg. Sure, that's the immediate cause, but what if the real story was buried much deeper under decades of mounting debt, financial desperation, and powerful banks that saw war as the ultimate business opportunity? What if I told you that Europe's great powers were essentially bankrupt long before the first shot was ever fired? And what if the assassination was just the perfect excuse they needed to solve a financial crisis that was about to tear their empires apart from the inside? Today, we're going to explore how mounting debts turned political rivalries into financial necessities, and how the greatest military conflict in human history might have actually been the world's most expensive and bloody debt consolidation program. Our story really begins back in the 1850s. This is when European powers discovered something revolutionary and incredibly dangerous. They figured out that you could borrow money to build an empire much faster than you could earn it through conquest. Britain led the way, taking out massive loans to lay railways across India, construct naval bases on 6 different continents, and maintain the largest military force the world had ever seen. And for a while, this system worked brilliantly, as long as the empire kept expanding and generating new sources of revenue to pay back the interest. But this is where the math starts to become lethal. By 1914, on the eve of the war, Britain's national debt had exploded to £650 million. That's an astronomical sum for the time, a figure that required constant, careful management of interest payments and refinancing just to stay afloat. France, Germany, and Russia all followed the exact same playbook, each borrowing staggering amounts to fund their own imperial ambitions. They all thought they were playing a game of global chess, a game of territorial expansion. In reality, they were playing a game of compound interest. And we all know the house always wins that game. Let's put this in perspective. Think about your own mortgage. Before you bought your house, you probably calculated your monthly payments, made sure you could handle the interest rate, and maybe even got pre-approved. Now, imagine your neighbor started buying up houses on the street, and your other neighbor started buying even bigger, more expensive houses. Suddenly, you feel this immense pressure to buy more houses yourself, just to keep up. That's exactly what happened to Europe's great powers. Except instead of houses, they were buying battleships, armies, and entire continents. And just like the housing bubble that led to the 2008 crash, everyone involved convinced themselves that the value of their assets, their colonies, would always rise enough to cover their ever-increasing debt payments. Germany offers the most dramatic example of this imperial debt spiral. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, German borrowing went into overdrive. The nation was desperately trying to challenge Britain's naval supremacy while simultaneously building railways across Africa and establishing colonies in the Pacific. The German government sold this massive debt to its people, and its banks with a simple promise: each new territory would pay for itself through resource extraction and trade. Sound familiar? It's the exact same logic that fueled the subprime mortgage crisis. But if you want to see a terrifying preview of what happens when this imperial debt spiral gets completely out of control, you have to look at the Ottoman Empire. In 1875, decades before World War I, the Ottoman government officially declared bankruptcy. Their debts had reached £200 million. And here, is the truly disturbing part. Their annual debt payments were more than half of their entire national revenue. Can you imagine a government where over 50 cents of every dollar collected goes straight to foreign bankers? Now, did the European creditors just write off this massive loss? Of course not. Instead, they formed something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was an organization run by foreign bondholders that gave them direct control over Turkish tax collection and government spending. It was, for all intents and purposes, a corporate takeover of a sovereign nation. For the other great powers of Europe, watching the Ottoman Empire get carved up by its creditors was a terrifying glimpse into their own potential future. They saw that financial collapse didn't just mean economic ruin. It meant the end of their sovereignty, the end of their empires. So, as we head into 1914, you have a continent full of empires drowning in debt, all terrified of the same fate that befell the Ottomans. They were locked in an economic death spiral, where the only way to service old debt was to take on new, even bigger debt to fund more expansion. War, in this context, wasn't just about nationalism or alliances. It became a release valve, a way to hit the reset button, to write off unpayable debts in a storm of fire and steel, and to potentially seize the assets of your rivals to pay your own bills. The assassination in Sarajevo wasn't the cause of the fire. It was just the match thrown onto a mountain of financial tinder that had been accumulating for over 60 years. What do you think? Was World War I an inevitable clash of empires, or the world's most brutal bankruptcy proceeding? Think about this for a second. A sovereign nation, the Ottoman Empire, controlling territory across 3 continents, essentially became a subsidiary of European banks. The sultans could still wear their fancy robes and hold their titles, but the real financial decisions were being made in London, Paris, and Berlin. This wasn't just debt restructuring. This was the blueprint for modern financial colonialism, and it terrified every other European power. They had just witnessed what happens when a debt spiral ends. They realized they were all trapped in the same mathematical death trap. The Declaration of London in 1909 made this dangerous game official. It formally recognized credit as an essential element of international alliances. Military partnerships were now explicitly tied to financial partnerships. When you signed up as an ally, you weren't just agreeing to fight together, you were agreeing to borrow together, guaranteeing each other's debts and sharing the financial risks of imperial competition. By 1914, every major European power was trapped in the same impossible situation. They owed massive debts that required constant territorial expansion just to service them. But territorial expansion required even more borrowing, which created even larger debts. The system had become mathematically unstable. Something had to give. Either these empires would find a way to dramatically increase their revenues, or they would face the kind of financial collapse that had just destroyed the Ottoman Empire. War, it turned out, offered both a solution and an excuse. Military victory would mean access to enemy territories and resources, potentially solving the revenue problem. Military necessity would justify levels of government borrowing that would be politically impossible during peacetime. And most importantly, war would allow governments to restructure their entire financial relationships with both their own citizens and their international creditors. Those European emperors weren't just expanding empires. They were expanding liabilities that would eventually consume everything they claimed to protect. And here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. By 1916, something unprecedented was happening in global finance. Britain wasn't just funding its own war. It was funding most of the empire's expenses, all of Italy's war costs, and 2/3 of what France and Russia were spending on their military operations. Think about that. One country was essentially bankrolling a world war involving dozens of nations. How does that even work financially? The answer lies in a web of international banking relationships that most people have never heard about, but which determine the fate of millions. When you understand how these financial arrangements actually worked, the entire war starts to look less like a political conflict and more like a massive debt collection operation, just with armies instead of bailiffs. Let's start with a question that should immediately grab your attention. Why was J.P. Morgan Jr., an American banker, organizing military supply contracts for European armies 2 years before America even entered the war? In 1915, Morgan assembled a syndicate of 2,200 American banks to float a massive $500 million loan to the Allied powers. But here's the truly remarkable part. This wasn't just a loan. Every single British munitions purchase had to go through Morgan's firms, giving American bankers direct control over European military procurement. When a foreign bank controls your military supply chain, are you still a sovereign nation or have you become something else entirely? Britain, the empire that ruled a quarter of the world's landmass, had essentially outsourced its war financing to Wall Street. The lion was borrowing money from the eagle just to buy bullets. The really wild part is what happened to interest rates during this period. As European governments borrowed more and more money to fund their military operations, the cost of borrowing just kept climbing. Higher interest rates meant that territorial expansion wasn't just politically desirable anymore. It was mathematically necessary. You needed new revenue streams just to service your existing debt, let alone fund new military campaigns. The entire system was a powder keg, and the match was about to be lit. Have you ever wondered what really caused World War I? We all learn about the assassination of an archduke, tangled alliances, and rising nationalism. But what if I told you the real reason the war became so devastatingly total was debt? A financial death spiral that made peace more dangerous than war. Let's dive in. By 1914, nations like France and Russia, despite having huge gold reserves, were in deep. They depended heavily on British and American credit to keep their war machines running. See, a military alliance isn't just a promise to fight together. It's a promise to share the financial burden, to keep each other's governments from going bankrupt. Now, Germany's situation was even more bizarre. Their central bank, the Reichsbank, was giving the government short-term loans, which were then paid off with long-term war bonds. This is a classic move called debt monetization. Essentially, Germany was printing money to pay the interest on money it had already borrowed, all to fund military campaigns that were supposed to capture enough loot to pay back the original loans. Does that sound familiar? It's a lot like the 2008 financial crisis, but instead of betting on mortgage-backed securities, these European powers were betting on victory-backed securities. Every new invasion was expected to pay for itself through captured territory, stolen resources, and massive payments from the losers. And who was bankrolling all of this? The giants of London's financial world. The Bank of England, the Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans. These weren't just neutral bankers. They were active players. Their own investment portfolios were tied directly to who won and who lost. Let me put it in modern terms. Imagine if Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan loaned billions to different sides in a war. Now imagine they also controlled the weapons factories supplying both armies. Do you think they'd stay neutral? Of course not. They'd have a massive incentive to influence the outcome. That's exactly what was happening in Europe. When Britain loaned money to France and Russia, British banks weren't just hoping to get paid back. They were betting everything on an Allied victory. When German banks financed Austria, they were betting on the Central Powers. This created a financial system where losing the war meant more than just political shame. It meant total economic collapse. It meant defaulting on your loans, being cut off from global credit, and having foreign banks take control of your country, just like they had with the Ottoman Empire. By 1916, credit was tightening and interest rates were soaring. For these indebted nations, the only way to avoid bankruptcy was to keep conquering more territory. They weren't fighting for glory or nationalism anymore. They were fighting to avoid financial foreclosure. The war had become a brutal game of musical chairs. The first nation to stop fighting would face complete economic ruin. This is why the conflict escalated so quickly and became so total. It wasn't enough to win a few battles or sign a peace treaty. Each side needed absolute, crushing victory to seize enough plunder and reparations to pay back their international bankers. Anything less meant financial devastation for generations. The human cost of this cold financial logic was staggering. The banking system had created a perverse reality where peace was more terrifying than war for the leaders of these countries. When your nation's survival depends on borrowed money, and your ability to borrow depends on winning wars, you don't have the luxury of choosing peace. What if I told you the story you learned about America in World War I, the story of heroic neutrality shattered by German submarines, is a carefully crafted myth? The real story is far more shocking. It's a story of Wall Street, immense fortunes, and a gamble that reshaped the world. Let's peel back the layers. The official narrative says America wanted to stay out of Europe's war. The reality? By 1915, America was already the chief financier and armorer for one side. The man at the center of it all was J.P. Morgan Jr. From his Wall Street office, he wasn't just a banker. He was the de facto quartermaster for the Allied war effort. He organized loans that would be worth over $35 billion today. But he did more than just lend money. Morgan's firm became the exclusive purchasing agent for Britain and France in the United States. Every rifle, every artillery shell, every bullet bought from American factories went through his books. This created a staggering conflict of interest. Morgan's entire financial empire was bet on an Allied victory. If the war ended in a stalemate or a German win, those massive loans would never be repaid, triggering a collapse of the American banking system. So while politicians in Washington spoke of peace and neutrality, the most powerful man on Wall Street had billions of reasons to keep the war going until his clients won. But Morgan was just the tip of the iceberg. By 1917, the private loans were so enormous that the U.S. government itself had to step in. The United States Treasury began lending directly to the Allies, eventually loaning over $10 billion, an astronomical sum that would be like lending several trillion dollars today. In just a few short years, America flipped from being a nation in debt to the rest of the world to becoming the world's biggest creditor. All of this was made possible by a brand new institution, the Federal Reserve, conveniently created in 1913, just a year before the war began. The Fed provided the financial machinery to print money and absorb the massive debts needed to fund the conflict. So, when German U-boats started sinking ships, was that the real reason America went to war? Or was it the tipping point for a nation that had already bet its entire financial future on an Allied victory? Imagine you loaned your life savings to a friend for a high-stakes bet. If they lose, you're bankrupt. Are you going to just stand by and watch? Or will you jump in and do whatever it takes to make sure they win? By 1917, America's financial entanglement was so deep that an Allied defeat was unthinkable. The U.S. had to enter the war to protect its own investments. The result was a seismic shift in global power. While Europe bled itself dry in the trenches, American industry boomed. Our factories churned out weapons and supplies. Our banks collected the interest, and our economy surged. The war wasn't just a military conflict. It was the largest financial transaction in history. It was the moment America stopped being a junior partner on the world stage and became the new economic empire, built on the debts of the old world. The story of WWI isn't just about soldiers and trenches. It's about dollars and cents and how a colossal financial gamble on Wall Street paved the way for the American century. Ever wonder what really caused World War I? We're taught it was about assassinations, alliances, and empires. But what if the real story is about money, debt, and a brilliant, ruthless financial strategy that changed the world forever? The human drama of the trenches is staggering, but behind the scenes, a different kind of war was being waged. European soldiers were dying to protect bond portfolios held by American financiers who had never seen a battlefield. Young men were killing each other to determine if J.P. Morgan's loans would be repaid. By the time America officially entered the war in 1917, it wasn't really a choice. We weren't picking sides based on values. We were protecting a financial investment that had become too big to fail. American soldiers weren't just fighting for democracy, they were fighting to collect debts owed to American banks. The numbers are insane. Between private syndicates and government lending, American financial institutions essentially controlled the outcome of the world's largest military conflict. European empires, rulers of the world for centuries, found themselves financially dependent on their former colony. This wasn't an accident. The same banks that created boom and bust cycles in American railroads had scaled up their operations to entire continents. They had figured out how to monetize global conflict. The longer the war, the more interest on loans, the more weapons sold, and the more financial power they gained over Europe. American banks had found the perfect business model: lend money to both sides while controlling the supply chains that decide who wins. But the real shocker is what happened after the fighting stopped. The armistice wasn't about peace. It was the largest debt restructuring in human history, disguised as a treaty. By 1919, the UK's national debt had exploded by more than 10 times. France and Germany faced similar financial ruin. These weren't just numbers. They were burdens that would crush national budgets for generations to come. And here's the financial shell game they played. Germany was forced to pay massive reparations to Britain and France. But how did Germany get the money? They took out loans from American banks. Britain and France then used that reparation money to pay their own war debts back to the United States. It was a perfect circle of debt. American banks were lending Germany money to pay reparations that flowed right back to them. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany paid 19 billion gold marks in reparations, but it borrowed 27 billion marks from American banks to do it. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't a peace agreement. It was a debt collection contract that made American banks the ultimate rulers of Europe's economy. European leaders thought they were borrowing to defend civilization. They discovered they were just business investments for American creditors who expected to be paid back in full with interest. The human cost was devastating. Economic policies were designed to prioritize debt payments over people's well-being. And these debts lasted for nearly a century. Germany made its final World War I payment on October 3rd, 2010. Let that sink in. 92 years to pay for a 4-year war. Britain finished paying the US in 2006. Generations of people spent their entire lives paying taxes for a war their grandparents fought in. While ordinary people suffered for a century, the banks that engineered this debt spiral became more powerful and profitable than ever. World War I created the blueprint for modern conflict. Wars create emergency borrowing, which allows financial institutions to lock in control over national economies for generations. Think about current events. Why do sovereign debt crises always lead to austerity policies that hurt citizens but help international creditors? Why do wars always lead to more government debt? Because WWI taught the world a lesson. Modern wars aren't just fought over land or politics. They're fought to create financial obligations that generate permanent revenue for international creditors. Those emperors signing treaties weren't expanding their empires. They were signing loan agreements that would bankrupt their nations. The war to end all wars didn't end war. It made war permanently profitable. We're not living in a world shaped by battlefield victories. We're living in a world shaped by the financial deals that funded them. The bankers won World War I, and we are all still paying the price for their victory. Thanks for watching.